Protests have been a cornerstone of American history, reflecting the nation's spirit of resistance and desire for justice. They have shaped policies, laws, and societal attitudes. Here are the top 10 most significant American protests, each leaving an indelible mark on the country. 1. The Boston Tea Party, 1773. This protest against British taxation without representation marked the beginning of the American Revolution. Patriots dumped chests of tea into Boston Harbor to challenge the Tea Act. It galvanized colonial resistance and set the stage for the fight for independence. 2. The Women's Suffrage March, 1913. Held the day before President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, this march in Washington, D.C., demanded voting rights for women. Thousands of women and their allies paraded down Pennsylvania Avenue, helping to build momentum for the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote in 1920. 3. The Civil Rights March on Washington, 1963. This historic march drew over 250,000 people to the National Mall, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. The march advocated for civil and economic rights for African Americans and helped pave the way for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. 4. The Stonewall riots, 1969. When police raided the Stonewall Inn, a gay bar in New York City, patrons fought back, sparking days of protests. These riots are widely regarded as the catalyst for the modern LGBTQ+ rights movement and are commemorated annually with pride events worldwide. 5. The Vietnam War protests, 1960s–1970s. Anti-war demonstrations erupted across the country, drawing millions of Americans. One of the most notable events was the 1969 moratorium to end the war in Vietnam, which mobilized over 2 million participants. These protests significantly influenced public opinion and U.S. foreign policy. 6. The Selma to Montgomery marches, 1965. These marches, organized to demand voting rights for African Americans, faced brutal resistance from police. The events, particularly Bloody Sunday, shocked the nation and led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act later that year. 7. The Occupy Wall Street movement, 2011. Occupy Wall Street began in New York City's financial district, protesting economic inequality and corporate greed. The movement popularized the phrase, "We are the 99%, and sparked discussions about wealth disparity, though it lacked clear policy outcomes. 8. The Women's March, 2017. Following the inauguration of President Donald Trump, millions of people around the world participated in the Women's March to advocate for women's rights, immigration reform, LGBTQ+ rights, and more. It was one of the largest single-day protests in U.S. history. 9. The Standing Rock protests, 2016–2017. The Dakota Access Pipeline protests were led by Native American tribes and environmental activists opposing the pipeline's construction through sacred lands and waterways. The protests drew international attention to indigenous rights and environmental protection. 10. The Black Lives Matter protests, 2020. Following the murder of George Floyd, millions protested against systemic racism and police brutality. These protests, spanning all 50 states and many countries, prompted widespread calls for police reform and racial justice, becoming one of the largest movements in American history. Each of these protests highlights the power of collective action in shaping America's social and political landscape. From fighting for independence to advocating for equality, these movements have driven significant change and continue to inspire future generations.